Hello everyone, today we continue with our History of Medievistics series. This had to last, I think, 2 videos, but it turned out to would last for 4. I don't know how much we will be covering today, but this may be also the most dense of the bunch. I always try to be uncomplicated, and especially there are these huge introductions, and I will try not to make them, especially because in the last video we have really looked at the beginnings of 19th century historiography, both as properly as strictly historiographical and historical tradition by this point, and as far as the German reevaluation of the Middle Ages was concerned. We pointed out in the previous videos mostly the Italian and the French tradition from the Renaissance through also the rise of French culture, especially in the 18th century as the first in Europe. The 19th century with the unification of Germany and its growth in a tentatively hegemonic direction, especially against the French, and so resuming some important sort of reconsideration of especially of the relations of the Carolingian legacy. Right, what does it mean to be German, French? Looking at that past, and accompanied by the general temper that was absolutely felt at this point in Europe regarding the revaluation of medieval past as the foundation of nations in the age, of course, of revolutions, of the spread of more extended electoral pools, right, basins. And the definition of a more sort of competitively outlined set of European powers contributes to this all. Fortunately, we're going to start soon a series about modern and contemporary history, probably from a broader point of view, not just the military one, which is mostly the only one we have looked at this time, so that we can appreciate better the plenitude of such landscape that is enormous, right? My relation with the 19th century is very complicated, in part because I don't know too much about it. I mean, among the various centuries in history, it's among one is especially in the in post-medieval ones that I know about the least. Not because I know a few about it, but let's say I have always thought that at least the basic information that I accumulated on it from sort of manuals and my university experience was a bit too conveniently accommodating regarding to lots of things, meaning that as I discovered the Middle Ages were really something different, and history altogether was really something different than what we are normally taught. And this is completely normal to acknowledge, by the way, as you go on, especially as a researcher and so on. Well, my impression is that the 19th century is probably one of the most misunderstood centuries of all. And it's especially true for a European, right? There are sort of course, every continent, every country has a different perspective on history in many ways. But it's obvious that as far as European nationalities are concerned, the 19th century really means a lot, and probably most of what founded the, in fact, contemporary awareness of our, in fact, modern national identities in ways that I cannot even begin to recollect in a video of this scope and size. However, it's always all baked into it. Right, you can't distinguish the two things, and especially about the Germans. Remember, this is a video about the history of medievistics, so we will mostly stick to the great works, of course, of Peirce, of Baetz, and beyond, trying to explain why this happened, right, as much as we've seen why, I don't know, Muratori and the Rerum Italicanum Scriptores had happened. There was a great inspiration there, and again, it's very interesting to notice that the most prolific countries and the sort of the path openers in medievistics were actually Germany and Italy as this sort of Holy Roman Imperial Diet, representing very much the archetypes also of, if you want, of cultural, national, even racial standards that, especially in the 19th century, start becoming very categorical, very even preconceptual, with social Darwinism, with properly pseudo-scientific racism that is more similar in the way, in fact, it develops in this post-traditional times to some sort of zoological materialism rather than a proper understanding of race in the traditional fashion. There is no doubt, however, that if any century after the Middle Ages sort of went the closest to systematically reconstruct the traditional meanings of that millennium, this is the 19th century. You can argue naturally that today we know the Middle Ages very well, better than in the 19th century, but as a leitmotif of this series, the point is that while, of course, for our own methodological and sort of scientific standards in general, our historiography is the most advanced, at the same time we should not leave aside not just the fact that this, of course, came on top on the works of the historiographers of the previous centuries that actually wrote pretty darn good stuff, but that this pretty darn good stuff was, in most of the cases, the product not just of a great work indeed, but also of an actually greater closeness, proximity to the actual beliefs that the same Middle Ages had cultivated. We've seen it in the video about, for example, the last episode. This was even truer, like in the first one, in a sense. Again, that's leitmotif. This could be true still today, depending on which sociocultural background you belong to in a broader sense, and how you look at history in that sense. That, of course, those people were closer to the actual beliefs of the time, that they understood that better, and in a sense, they almost gave them for granted, right? As today we give for granted that in a terrible way, in fact, much worse than in any age, our own moral standards in particular are supposed to be the highest, and truly in this sense in comparison with our predecessors, we have consistently skipped in our educational systems the fact that morality is not something that simply changed as a fashion, as a whim, from this century or another. It's not like the 18th century is the age of, the Enlightenment, and the 19th century is the age of Romanticism. It can be the age of very different things, but they're also very much intertwined, right? It's like saying, the preconditions of 18th century philosophy are all contained in the 17th century. And you can argue that this is true for basically any other concept that at some point had already been expressed in previous times. So it's actually a complicated topic that, in the case of Germany, becomes even spicier, because Germany came out of feudalism literally at the beginning of the 19th century. Let's be honest about this. Yes, of course, in the 18th century, Germany had an important flourishing, had further developed, but it was actually, as a Central European country, very different one from Western. Once it had historically been considered, especially because of the political fragmentation, a sort of weak area. Germany and Italy were considered a bit like the battlegrounds of Europe, at least for a while. And Germany has in its so-called Sonderweg, and so this essentially special way to everything, the German way to history as well, but in its peculiar culture, etc. It's something which is not really a 19th century myth. It was, or if it developed in that direction, further in that direction, is not really, because Germany did not own such very peculiar characteristics and some important, if anything, potential. Not much the closeness to the Middle Ages, because if you look at, Eastern Europe or the Balkans or even other areas in the world, of course, you can argue that the Middle Ages existed there. If you look at some, Caucasian warriors from World War I, like they literally were knights in medieval armor, right? Even with muskets and not rifles, but next to them, but still, right? And of course, Germany was, in general, an advanced country. In the 19th century is the moment in which it really steps up to a degree that is often hyper also blown in certain perspectives that mostly belong to the 20th century, not the 19th per se, right? This would be more evident if we were to start, as I wanted to, by the way, a series about the Franco-Prussian War. Right, we have also to resume Prussian warfare and even just the history of von Clausewitz and von Scharnhorst about the Landwehr and actually preparing a video on all this. And it's difficult to make a video on Medievistics without considering these specific aspects. Naturally, there's a lot of antiquarian interest in Europe. This is the age of Wagner, of Rossini. Actually, a very interesting period. And so think about the exchange. For example, in this perspective, the German-Italian exchange, Rienzi, William Tell. You have all revisitation of the past in a moment in which these nations were also somehow struggling for their own political independence and sort of showing not just what their own national past had been, but also celebrating the ones of other countries. This is a very important step also in the recognition of European national identities. I mean, the age of revolutions had definitely created some interconnections all across Europe. As you know, the episodes like 1848, the 1848 revolutions were obviously timed all together. They were bloody. The 19th century was an incredibly bloody and violent century. There are people who think for some reason that, I don't know, Europe froze after the Congress of Vienna, and that things remain just the way they were. The 19th century has an incredibly, even if you look just at Europe, of course, we don't have to tell this to the Americans or to to the South, to the British, and to also many other peoples out there. But it is for Europe still a moment of actual continuity in tradition. What I always say is that the Middle Ages actually stop, in a sense, in France in 1792, basically, but in Central Eastern Europe in 1918, right? And therefore, different countries have also different ways to this, and the Germans, in particular, for so many different reasons, are the ones that feel the greatest need and sort of the greatest pride. It sort of rings best for them, like the revisitation of probably a German Middle Ages that I also made a video on in a series. I remember the title because I think it was on the Romantic Middle Ages. It was talking specifically about, in fact, the German model of historiographical interpretation and its mythology, but also its correctness and its, again, historically accurate contributions. Because now we're, by the way, entering with the 19th century also, especially in the latter part of it, in very high levels of historiographical accuracy and precision. We've seen that, again, these countries are among the first that probably start providing a systematically uniformed and sort of critically edited amount of medieval sources that you can still access basically in the same editions at some point online today, with these incredibly famous names such as the Monumenta Germaniae Historica, right? Now, the reevaluation of the Middle Ages was not happening just in Germany, and it would be perhaps too long to simply digress on many different countries. For example, England had very lots of interesting things going on in the meanwhile. But if anything, it's better to deal with this in a dedicated video. But in German culture especially, the emphasis on the positive influence of the Germanic world's spontaneous energies on the Latin Christian Europe rooted in Mediterranean civilization came to affirm themselves in a pretty consistent fashion. This cannot be understood without some perspective, right? Obviously, this passed through, and this is especially true for Northern Europe. I mean, Germany is not a Northern European country, but in general, like the broader Germanic world, all right, was the one that between the 19th and the 20th century developed, for obvious reasons, the most sort of categorically racialistic distinction between groups, not just in the world, but within the same Europe, right? And of course, there is an important divide if you look at the historically so-called Latin nations or Western Europe in a sense, in their ethnocultural background compared to Central Eastern Europe, especially the Baltic. When you look, as you know, when you take, if you have done it, I've done it this year, DNA tests, right? You're properly told. We're not told this. It's incredibly complicated to read that stuff, right? Because it's never. I get this very weird experience on Schwerpunkt of lots of people. This is beginning that. For some reason, the worst ones are the ones that say, my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was this guy, and actually, I know it, it's all certified, you know. And these are always people they're normally from America, and they come on my videos commenting just to say this stuff. So you never see them around, but they have somehow to claim in front of the world that, they descend from these people. Or they... I don't have so many talking about genetics, but let's say things are much more complicated than they seem. If anything, there is mostly a millenary-old realization of the fact that as Europeans, we belong mostly to this, essentially, there are different names, so they're just conventional North Atlantic background. Then essentially you have this, more often than not, especially because, again, the Balkans... Eastern Europe is a bit messier, let's say, but normally you have this corded ware, essentially a Yamnaya ancestor for which you know that some of your ancestors, this is part of your ancestors, even from Southern Europe, came from the Baltic at some point. But we're talking about a long time before. People sometimes read this as, I don't know, this happened, I have this blood because of migration here. No, that's not what it means. Like those data, first of all, are based on databases that are very approximated, but they don't have a national, even a geographical, let alone a political tag, right? You can't say, I don't know, you come from Spain and you see some data like percentage from Romania, you say, oh my God, this is the Visigoths. That's not how it works. That's basically just a proximity in genetic similarity. And surely there is some origin of that kind, but you can't track it. It's a much more generic and ancient process that also escapes simply because we don't know the history of I don't know, the second millennium BC already, where most of this stuff also is rooted. And you can't reconduct it to just the last, 1,000, 1,500 years or something like that. And there is, of course, there is an important division historically. It's a bit like the ideal division between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. Actually, the biggest divide has always been between the West and the East, still to this day. But, of course, like Northeastern Europeans look significantly different from Southwestern Europeans. When you look at their genetic background, of course, by European standards, all right? But when you realize the broader European picture, you realize that there is actually a very strong ethnic homogeneity and intertwinement between the various European areas. And that, in general, lots of things happen in between, which are exactly the... one of the most interesting aspects of content of this historiographical, this ethnographical mythology. Meaning what? Meaning that, of course, when the Germans began to look at their past, they couldn't help but identify themselves, in a sense, as the Germanic peoples. Now, how correct is this? Well, roughly, you can say, but not completely. And depending on the relative terms, also in large parts, not true if you take the national and especially nationalistic interest particularly at heart. There's an ethnic similarity there is definitely an ancestor in common, but you also realize that Europeans, exactly because of the waves of peoples that came from the north, that basically informed also what the greatest classical ancient cultures, I mean, the Dorians came essentially from that. The Latins came essentially from that. And we know this pretty well, also from a linguistical point of view, that at least managed to, as we realize that these peoples from the north managed to culturally hegemonize, again, populations in the south that were not, in fact, simply the descendants, naturally, of northern Europeans. But that began to constitute some broader topos and a major issue regarding, for example, ancestors battle on. I don't know, during the Renaissance, the 30 Years' War, for example, the Spanish and the Swedes, they were not just two random countries at that point, entered in veritable arguments regarding whose legacy the Gothic one was, right? The Spanish went as far as saying that the true Goths were them because the Visigoths had at least installed themselves. Peninsula, as you know, in the Iberian Peninsula, as you know, the Swedes technically maintained the terminology, at least up to a certain point in history, in the modern contemporary, I think, as well, of the king of the Goths as well. And so that element of different Gothic, so to say, in a broader generic sense. I made a video about the Geats, for example, if you're interested in that, aside from my videos about the Ostrogoths or the Visigoths, so-called, that shows you also, in fact, what kind of sort of also ethnonymical origin that these terms really have, and what kind of population distribution or geographical origin some groups had in their ethnogenesis in a broader political and cultural way. So this became a big deal, especially as Germany was becoming, as we've seen, the tendentially and preemptively hegemonic country in Europe, meaning that being surrounded by other countries and having a scarce access to the sea fundamentally, compared to the greater powers of Britain, France, etc., developed this necessary sense of expansionistic and preemptive almost expansion as the foundation of its strategic policy. I made a video about that, of the plans from, I don't know, the famous Schlieffen plan and all the preceding ones since von Moltke Senior, etc. It's a little but compact and useful video that I made there. It will come handy to talk more about, especially second half of the 19th century Prussian and therefore German at some point warfare. And this passed through a great deal, again, of a racialistic characterization, the contrast between this essentially corded ware peoples against the broader Pelasgian mass of the Mediterranean that were understood in deeply, in fact, archetypal ways. And one thing that we actually showed on Schwerpunkt is that the most Apollonian kind of deifying ideal that the world witnessed was truly in the aforementioned Hellenic and Roman civilizations. The Germans, the Celts as well, had actually a darker worldview, and being less developed than their southern neighbors, they sort of developed some sort of fringe countercultural attitude, even when especially their elites were promoting the same old sort of Indo-European nobiliar elite, conceptual, like moral matrix, right? And in this sense, the idea of an impetus, of a furor teutonicus, for example, sometimes opposed also to a furor gallicus, as the French revitalized on the other side, got blended with historiographical interpretations. So what I was about to say before is that how, for example, the German progress and development to some point, especially in the 20th century, was taken especially in the Anglo-American world, for sort of Germanic sympathies, or think about the enormous amount of German Americans, especially in the Midwest, in the center of the United States, would sort of try to glorify this civilization through the roofs. And today, even among specialists of World War One, there are incredibly ferocious ideological debates regarding things like Britain should have not entered war against Germany even to save Belgium, because after all, nothing would have happened. Instead, the war dragged on, and all those dead from the British side and whining about that. I have expressed my thoughts on this in that video about how World War One happened. So if you are interested specifically in that perspective, you should check the video out. But the magnification, etc., of, for example, German technology, advancement, social development, if you actually look at it in strictly, there's no doubt that Germany was a very advanced country by global standards. But if you look at the West, and generally speaking, or Britain or America, and even in a sense France, and depending on what are you really looking at by degree, you realize that Germany, again, was if anything, a young nation, a fresh nation. There was really a sense of even a moral race at play as a major factor of German confidence and mentality. It wasn't all due to, or at least the militaristic mindset of the Prussians enforced in the rest of Germany was not really something so alien to the general spirit of the German nation and the traditions that they had historically developed. Yes, Germany was quite different within itself at some point, but it was a rampant system. It was one that, when unified with the Zollverein, with the interconnect, with the abatement of feudal boundaries, etc., exploded, as you know, and created a massive headache to everybody involved, like France, Britain, the Tsarist Empire, and more. The same Austrians were essentially dwarfed by this power. As you know, the 1866 war brought straight to essentially the fracture of the Habsburgic Empire to the so-called double monarchy, so that we properly speak from 1867 of Austria-Hungary, not simply of Austria. There, the Prussians and the Italians, as you know, carried out a concerted effort to enfeeble this giant, right, of European, mostly Central Europe, even though it controlled parts of Southern and Eastern Europe as well. So it's all a huge deal. It's also, in that case, for example, what kind of Germany do you want to envisage, right? Think about the influence of confessional cultures, Prussia being Protestant. When you look at Austria, and the fact that up until late, it could have, still by the 50s of the 18th century, of the 19th century, the Habsburgs could fundamentally think to unite Germany, but they wouldn't go for it. And just think, in that sense, the Holy Roman Empire did not exist anymore because it had been secularized by Napoleon. But in a sense, the Habsburgs were sort of the most obvious heir to its legacy, and the most directly, the most direct continuation of power in the process. And just think about the wide diversity of this system, how odd it had been, among various things, for the sake of saying German nationalism, that Prussia and Austria had fundamentally developed their empires mostly outside of Germany rather than within, to become those great powers. And the relations with the Slavs in particular, that was, naturally not a very a very tender-hearted one, and that's a radically underestimated topic, because today the left and the right have decided, respectively, that post-socialist Europe are just victims. We have to cancel any difference because as if trauma did not exist, or in respectively, again, with the right things, that instead they're the heroes that save tradition, whatever, without looking at an inch of what kind of societies communism has left. And so there is this huge elephant in the room, that to say not just the severe underdevelopment of Eastern Europe historically wise, but the actual colonizing dominance of the Germans over Central and even parts of Eastern Europe, which is something that directly informs the same nationalistic, socialistic concept of Lebensraum, which was also a 19th century idea, like one of a people that, just like during the migration era or before the time of the Cimbrian, the Teutonists, could simply swarm across the fields of Ukraine and claiming like what was theirs by right of essentially racial supremacy. Today, some neo-Nazi, neo-fascist people I've talked to are basically saying, "Oh, well, it's so silly," like, or at least those people who idolize Hitler and stuff, but they don't even know what that was about, right? And they think that, I don't know, it was silly that in the 1930s they thought that the Slavs were racially inferior, and that, at least I translated in the terms that we're interested in here, that as if they had been so developed, so gracious cultures or countries or peoples that had succeeded in history. No, right? You have to be objective about the whole, and you can't erase history. You can't unsee, right, both the mistakes and the failures of the various elements involved. So I say this, especially the latter, because it seems to me that when, especially Americans, there are plenty of try to, you see, before it was the Germans that were the great thing that people inspire to. Now, from a couple of decades, mostly because of Russian propaganda, it's the Slavs, right? Everything, what was ideally like the nice, tidy German town with all the women in braids, all attractive. Now it's been shifted towards the East, except neither of these words reflect that anymore, unfortunately. And even when they did, in a sense, they were still words that would look at today's conservatism as some sort of subversive, inferior, socialistic garbage, right? And that's the problem that people have. It's a sort of historical fantasy, fantasizing cosplay, where you make up history according to what you want to see or you don't want to see, and leaving fundamentally secluded from a deeper understanding of the entire system, of which you also were at some point part. And said by a person who actually reiterated in the previous videos as well, that actually finds an enormous deal of accuracy in the actual in the views that these older, more archetypally and traditionally oriented 19th century, and sometimes again nationalistic, racistic, there is no doubt about this, actually had as a vision of that world. Again, uncontroversially, it's like the other week's video about the idea that feudalism never existed, right? Which today people like to aggress, like the idea that everything it's a forever myth that you must debunk, as if nobody had debunked, or as if the myth had ever existed, or there were scholars who were stupid and you instead, by copying something from the internet from someone else, you can actually understand and lecture others about, right? You're not more intelligent than a 19th century historian or anthropologist. I mean, think about the Grimm brothers. Think about all that enormous pool of culture with capital C that is there, and that people who declaredly have any kind of interest in tradition regularly do not care absolutely about, do not read, do not consult, and so on. And you have no idea how much those traditional beliefs were not just at the root of this medievistic development in Germany, but also not in Germany, but how much they were at the root of culture in the 19th century, regardless of the fact that, again, most of this was post-traditional, in a sense a reaction also to the excesses, to the secularizing and rationalizing excesses of the Enlightenment, etc. The reason why I started with this perspective, in fact, is that mass society especially was very sensitive to racialism, because they began to identify it mostly not with an estate, with a status, with the actual level of power of the individual. This is actually even a more important topic in and of itself, but with the nation. So essentially you were born on a piece of dirt, and again, you looked in a certain way, more or less, by the way, because it's not like there was this enormous again, a likeness again, before we said by global standards, Europeans are incredibly cohesive, genetically. But by European standards, they're also very different indeed. And even within single European countries, things were very different, including, and unfortunately, this also leading to the most genocidal fury of the 20th century, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, exactly because ethnicities there were all composed. In fact, large chunks of the population that were not of the same background in many ways. Right? Think about, again, Central and Eastern Europe and the regular, again, Germans, A series Slavs, B series Slavs, Jews, and again, all scattered, all intertwined with one another because of the very complicated history that these countries technically have, that also mirrored in part the scarce level of cultural homogenization due to the lack of some strong statehood historic. So it's complicated also in this regard. And you can argue almost that Central and Eastern Europe had more ethno-racial complexes exactly due to this, right? For example, the Judenhass was historically very intense, exactly in the places where the Holocaust mostly took place in Central and Eastern Europe, in terms of, in that case, by size of the Jewish communities, not like the Nazis didn't rake Jews from also Western Europe, but say before, like countries like the Netherlands or Italy had not just smaller amounts of Jews in their countries, but they had historically been, while segregated, actually, however, in contact with society. They were, say, educated. They partook the same level, more or less, of social-cultural development of the rest. In fact, some of them were also in Germany. This was the case by a degree, right? Of course, there were some Jews that were obviously, given that in most cases, just like a religion, indistinguishable from any other typical German, or even whiter, more Aryan, so to say, than a typical average German. And so there is a lot going on, which indeed anti-traditional mass society is not able to handle, because it's easier for the dumber masses to say, okay, we have to be all alike, without understanding the complexities of this, including the fact that, as you know, during World War I, a part of the Jews, especially the ones who were not from the socialistic side of the aisle, and that would in fact become fascistic after the war in some cases, and the probably very early fascistic movements themselves were fanatic nationalists, and they served their fatherland in very heroic ways. We've seen this in that video about the Freikorps, where we saw how actually when the same German government in the midst of the war began to scapegoat the Jews because they were apparently the backstabbers, why the Germans were not winning, according to the same army's stats that were destroyed as a consequence because of the outcome, the Jews had actually been disproportionately represented in excess to the other German nationals in the front lines, right? And this is really speaking volumes about the complexity of the world picture. Naturally, we're not going to descend in the matters of the Jewish question, but I think Jewish history in Europe is relatively straightforward. Like, there are specific reasons why in Central and Eastern Europe the Jews were considered less, because they were more marginated, right? While in the 18th century the Germans were having Enlightenment, at that point the Jewish Enlightenment in Central Europe, not in other parts of Europe, in Eastern Europe, they never had an Enlightenment. Nobody ever had an Enlightenment. We're just basically learning how to read at the time. So again, and aside from the fact that many of them came from the Eastern Europe, and so there were actually Eastern immigrants in those communities, and they began to look at socialism to improve their desperate, hopeless social condition. Of course, the association of the Jew with the Bolshevik, etc., came around and developed further. And remember that, the massacres in Germany during the First Crusade were, as long as tradition was there, were put down, protecting the Jews, in fact, by both the princes and the bishops that also were incredibly aware of the ultimate traditional Catholic and eschatological role that the Jewish people have for Christianity. Right? You cannot touch the Jews without touching the Christians, and I can assure you that we are extremely defensive about our Jews. And in any case, and this is again, in fact, a very old thing. It sounds paternalistic. It sounds sort of weird, but again, if you are aware of the official doctrinal position of the Church towards the Jews, you know what you mean as well. It's also brutal because it is still discriminating, but at least it historically makes a very specific distinction of the Jews from any other people in positive terms, and functional to the shared, of course, scriptural background. In any case, this is something we'll talk about in another video. The point that I was making, though, is that while indeed the 19th century mass ideologies, mostly statalistic, nationalistic, etc., were, and so the ones that could be colored in some more specifically identitary fashion, the socialists at some point were also nationalists, but they were at least mostly pushing in determined, especially in non-war times, against, of course, like the bulk of this national citizenry as such. Like it was considered, they considered that universal voting did not exist yet, right? So the people that in the 19th century got the right to vote were still some kind of elite, and they were in fact, especially at the middle class level, the most sensitive to patriotic rhetoric, etc., and also for good reasons, right? And so we all know what happened, especially in the 20th century, is the culmination of those ideologies and or specific paths that some decided to make them take, and or at least some failed attempts at reviving traditions in radical ways, but skipping some fundamental aspects of the same doctrine. I mean, even a Nietzsche did not know, if you read The Birth of Tragedy, actually what that traditional role of the Apollonian and Dionysian actually was. He sort of counterposes. Eventually he corrected a bit himself, but in other works. But you understand that even the people claiming will to power were just mostly making leverage on a much diluted traditional concept of the same, right? Violence must be rigidly disciplined. It isn't simply something like you have to act without thinking. I mean, you should do that if you are God. If you the more divine you are, the closer to God you are. Not in the sense that the average idiot can act without thinking. That's how you send just people to the front to throw in the meat grinder. It's not like these people are actual heroes or capable of who knows what, right? In heroically transcending fashion. I just made a video about that topic, by the way. But behind all this, we should point out that not only Germany had a very good sort of historical and cultural tradition by this point, and that it blossomed further at this point, in fact, but that the wide-ranging new medievalist research, while seeking to integrate political action within its social context, so definitely being very sensitive to the aforementioned kind of ideologies, actually arose from a much more serious and, in fact, traditional elite, and so morally and scientifically uplifted background that had been just sort of gradually eroded by this new sort of ideological tempests, but not quite blown away by that. And it had in fact arisen from the 18th century fusion of a universal philosophy of history with the meticulous efforts of erudite scholars who had long engaged in a Europe-wide competition to scrutinize sources. In other words, they were pretty good historians. They had a great cultural background. They were much closer to traditional beliefs. And again, Germany was actually not that developed, and that helped initially to wake up these people to innovation, to even to modernity in a sense, but while maintaining its traditional core to an extent. And this is actually the combination, if you look at throughout all powers in history, when they blossomed and they really got it. This combination between, this balance actually between modern and tradition is typical of all the major emerging power in European history. This was the time of the Germans that truly got it in the 19th century. Now, in German culture, which was particularly enthusiastic about rediscovering medieval civilization, as we've seen, pivotal philological advancement in European medieval studies emerged. This included the critical editing of sources through exhaustive comparisons of manuscripts or documents, systematic cross-referencing of sources to illuminate research topics, and rigorous critical analysis of all prior scholarly interpretations, including investigations into their success and interconnections. This picture is crucial because it starts injecting basically everything available in the research in ways that were to be systematically reviewed by, again, fundamentally an aggregation of scholars, of historians, of people who had been erudite, had been antiquarians, had, in a sense, cultivated very much, for example, their own local history within Germany, with all that sort of, all those feudal states was quite a thing historically. So that there was also certain care in the organization of their own history, their own sources, their archives, their general knowledge. In fact, seasoned with an incredibly strong amount of mythology, at least of folklore, that we know all very well and we have discussed in different videos, including, I don't know, the fact of having still horses' heads in place, like Norway's houses' head, something like that. It's an incredibly old thing, as you know. That the more we go back, the more we see in what had become by this point also the more modernized and secularized countries back in the day. And so with a very interesting lens in the interpretation of this. Besides, if you look at the chronology of this, even generationally speaking, this is very important, what moved peoples and what kind of brought to this. We are essentially in just not the Restoration proper period, but in a quite peculiar one, right? A period that begins, in fact, in 1826, right? Napoleon had been dead from 5 years. I think Tolstoy was to be born 2 years later or something. And so essentially, you can look at, if you are a person even born at this time, you look at 50 years back in time, if you are in your 20s and your 30s, it's the Napoleonic era. Your father had fought in it, right? We've seen exactly this scenario mostly from a Prussian perspective. In the case of Wilhelm Stieber, right? It was born in actually 1818, and that would become, as you know, the father of Prussian secret services. So we are also heavily involved, naturally, in the countering and the suppression of revolutionary movements in a very rigid and militaristic Prussia, which paradoxically was fomenting revolution in Germany to allow at least a Prussian takeover in certain cases, but I mean, not that kind of revolution at least. Why is 1826 important and so loaded, therefore, in this? Because this is the year that witnessed the launch of the, in fact, monumental Monumenta Germaniae Historica, spearheaded famously enough by Georg Heinrich Pertz, a Hanoverian scholar. As you know, every time you have to cite the Monumenta, like normal, at least the early publishing, Hanover, because it's naturally written in Latin, and even introductions are written in Latin. This is beautiful, by the way, because it shows you also what kind of, if not classicistic, but sort of traditional, like these countries had Latin as their official language of the state, of the rule, of higher culture, right? Also in Germany, of course. And so this was not like everyday's, average mass society person's work. This stuff was highly academical, highly elitary, and also destined, of course, to an international use as well, because also other countries were beginning, thanks to such works that, I would like to stress, did not exist before in kind, the histories of these countries. Again, without the Rerum Italicanum Scriptores were really the first, and the Monumenta Germaniae Historica, the concept of properly having a set of specific sources of references, uniformed according to standards and high sound criteria of philological, historical, linguistical, codicological accuracy in the reconstruction of the texts. There was not such thing like that edition. All right, there wasn't. There were histories written mostly in the modern age. I'm sure I've made a video about this already. We also explained this in the previous videos, but didn't stress it enough. Essentially, these guys were, in some instances, in possession of specific manuscripts they could access in, again, cathedral libraries, all these places. Consider that this is Europe before 2 world wars, so an enormous lot of archives was available, right? The archives of Naples, for example, were immense. All the Angevin history of Naples was there. They were destroyed during World War II. Just imagine that. And, of course, Germany as well did not really, come out very lightly out of the war. Let's put it in this way, and some even of the historical centers were destroyed, were bombarded. As you know, if you have visited Germany, how many are beautifully reconstructed, but still, in fact, modern in that way. And just look at movies from the year. Look at the Blue Angel, the Azure Angel, which is a masterpiece, and you can see how Germany was before bombardments, like all those timber houses. But very much like following not even the medieval, but the modern pattern, how they had developed in the 16th and the 17th century. You can't but have a true love for the Middle Ages by looking at that world that is so oddly close and similar to that still, right? There are beautiful images of that also from old silent movies, for example. If you look at Murnau, if you look at, there's plenty of that stuff, even just from a documentary point of view, how that world was before the destruction, right? In fact, much less modern and advanced, as we were saying before, the technologistic and positivistic obsession for progress, industrialization was sort of stamped on Germany, that remained overall not, just like today, it's a rich country, but it's not as rich as, I don't know, well, Switzerland is easy, but I don't know, even France or the UK, like it's something else, all right? It remains a big industrialized, rich country, but in this sense, the size also dilutes the actual wealth across the people. It's a very, very big system, very expensive system to maintain. And so it sort of always was. It wasn't much ever an elite place, so astronomically above average in a sense. But this was in and of itself an enormous accomplishment. Again, for a country that had not known a de facto political cohesion since like a very long time, or at least in strictly unified terms ever, right? So it's incredibly relevant. Let's look briefly also at people like Pertz's profile. Right, he was himself from, again, a Nova. He was a Novarian scholar trained in Göttingen's philological tradition that was quite peculiar and advanced, to especially preserve and edit medieval German texts for national historical identity. Right, it was really, of course, as we said before, this was an elite thing. It was not really for. But it was, in fact, aiming at bringing Germany to the higher level of national and international referentiality, right? As a necessary actor into the world picture. This is interesting because Germany at this point, we're in 1826, did not quite have that rank yet, right? It was yet to unify. There were lots of sort of divides between, but culturally speaking, right, this cultural awareness began to take on ever more distinguished national characters. This is a bit like von Clausewitz. Like until, he wrote that thing like we're in the 30s. The work is basically finished, even though he was to finalize it in the following months. Hadn't he died, as you know, during the Polish uprisings of illness. By the way, not in combat. It was dramatically frequent at the time. But it's not until, in fact, the German unification that, for example, the von Kriege is translated ever. And today you would say, well, but von Clausewitz. Yeah, well, von Clausewitz is still not today considered as a standard basic text or theory to educate, to form properly the military, the official cadres in our armed forces. And this is really terrifying to think about that, because you realize that how the world was really uninterested in its staggering growth. One of the MGH, we usually call the Monumenta Germaniae Historica, actually understand what it means. The historical monuments, so of course like the monument as in this case the works, all the various sources of the historical monuments of Germany. All right. And one of its early contributors, Georg Weitz, there was a jurist and historian from Schleswig in the north who studied under Leopold von Ranke in Berlin, produced, starting in 1844, in definitely a positivist scientific climate, the first systematic study of medieval institutions up to the 12th century. Famously known, the Deutsche Verfassungs, that is to say, the, let's say, German, in this case, constitutional history, right, which examine essentially political and social systems in parallel as they evolve, reflecting, in this case, Weitz's training in legal history, and also Ranke's emphasis on objective source analysis. This aspect is quite fascinating because positivism takes on different forms. From one side, you have, let's say, the most pushed, if anything, technologistic and economicistic idea of progress that eventually spread further, especially from America, Fordism, Taylorism. And so, of course, it's something also present. I don't know if you read Dickens, the mockery of British positivism and industrialization, all this kind of stuff. That's why, as we was saying before, when you look at Germany, there was definitely industrializing, but was yet in these early years, again from the 20s, the 30s, the 40s of the 19th century, was not quite there as we intended. It's more like a different approach that I honestly am. I'm not a positivist in general, but I say that I'm a positive person, and in general, since this touches on me personally, because since I reconstruct battles, my interpretations must be somehow rational and positive, meaning positive, not, with a smile at the end of the paper. Positive in the sense that they must show the feasibility, let's say the heuristic accomplishment of this research. Well, you can't start, say, reconstructing a battle as the point of it all and not providing with a coherent explanation of how it went, right? If you were not a positivist or you didn't have a positive aim or success in this case, you would say, well, we don't know how this battle went. We can't know. It's a sort of, say, skepticism is not the opposite of positivism, but in general, the latter attitude is much more widespread today than it was at the time. And I really understand these historians, because when I began my academic research, I was really, like, you're inexperienced. But the reason why they make you, when you get a doctorate, even if you don't know it at the beginning, is learning how to actually work on your own, learning really the historian's crafts, but on your own skin, right? You can't be supported, you can be tutored, you can be supervised, but in general, right, where to find the sources, how to use them, etc. It's something you have to do by yourself. And in today's education, even if you study 5 years at university, it's not like you immediately get that in that straightforward fashion, right? Also, this must be, obviously, it must have a positive aim. You start a doctorate to hopefully finish it, not to just say, oh, well, okay, we'll stop and resume, right? Even though this sounds a quite romantic 19th century, in fact, kind of attitude towards studies. You can do that during the degree if you have time and money to waste, which I didn't do, even though I didn't have, I could waste it in theory. But you must come to a point whereby, like, you will be judged by the actual outcome, the actual conclusions of this research. What is this, and what has it brought to? So the way Weiz's work, and in general the MGH of the time, can be considered positive in its scientific nature is, of course, that the presentation of these sources was given as a general given, meaning that this is the correct way of doing so. We are really super cool and precise. It's a bit of that German stereotype of, not of perfectionism, but let's say of we go by the rules and this is how it works, and there's basically no other way, because this way is the best way to do it, which actually strives away a bit of flexibility and therefore also of efficiency at the end of the day. But of course, these are very good works. They're still used today, a testament to the fact that they succeeded in their purpose. Yet another very important way Germany contributed to European cultures in quite, again, an intimate and foundational way. Again, the history of historiography, we're all extremely thankful for that. Besides, we should point out that the MGH, notoriously for those who use them, contain not just German history, German sources, but actually this expresses also the mindset of these researchers at the time. Basically, the entire Holy Roman Imperial sources, or at least something that was more connected with the various, for example, imperial and royal legislations. There are fully fledged, I don't know, Italian chronicles in that, and Italy was sort of much more productive historiographically in the Middle Ages, basically any other country in the world. So they would obviously enter some of that. They didn't complete that in the way, in fact, already Muratori in the 18th century had succeeded in doing so with his stuff. And here the Germans basically add their own block to it, and they integrate it into it. And it's really important. Of course, it's not complete. It's not like there is all the sources ever. For this, we rely today on, not just updated editions of the same MGH, because within the same, as we've seen also for the Rerum Italicarum Scriptores, that was the same case. There are different editions still to this day. The institution is still there, right? And these are some, again, of the many prides of European culture still. But of course, there are lots of other sources that are constantly edited, because at some point, editing a source in a properly philological fashion is very complicated, is very demanding. There are many other authors that have to research many other sources and manuscripts that are found and edited. This is most of the problem also. That's where the positivistic intent is. Like, these are all the sources that exist it's not like they actually believed it at the time, but they had by themselves, because remember, these are sources collection, so it's something very different from mere, this is not a general inquiry in, German history. There were many at this point, we will see now. But they were just the basis for allowing those reflections on the sources. And then, of course, the idea that there are so many other works, minor ones to integrate. There are some disciplines that are yet forming in academia. Anthropology is just sort of gradually taking shape. It's all, there's, as we've seen, not even this enormous European interconnection, even though, again, historically, it had been the case from a long time, and this is also, in fact, a big international deal. However, again, our own today's standards were not met at the time, so there was a bit of a foundational attitude, like these are the official sources, we are aware of the different manuscript traditions, probably some other will come up, but for now we just give this stuff. Today we don't talk just about Germany though, because aside from the fact that we browsed German Romanticism, even if just cursorily at some point, we also will have to come back on that, but we have to look at the rest of Europe too. In the meanwhile, for example, in France, the Maurists that we have encountered in previous video, these were essentially a branch of the Benedictine order that had specialized in diplomatics. They had begun to collect their own. They were from Paris. They had begun to collect their lots of sources of diplomas, and so studying the institutions that issued them, etc. Now, as you know, something a bit inescapable in France, like the revolution, had swept and disrupted these ecclesiastical institutions. This again was an enormous tragedy in the history of mankind. Let's be honest, like you can absolutely give a price to this as much as to people's lives, and yeah, it was, with absolutely the loss of this stuff was definitely equatable or superior to the one of many people's lives. The Maurists, however, were succeeded by the diligent work of the École des Chartes, founded in 1821, thus something also more expensive than diplomatics because diplomatics, as we explained in the previous video, is something more attentive to the actual institution behind the charter in and of itself than the paleographical, so the scriptural and the writing, properly the script, aspect, and codicology as the study of the manuscript as an archaeological piece are naturally taking shape themselves, because again, you can't study really one without the other, right? And so France, of course, during the French Revolution, Napoleonic period, had witnessed, if anything, an incredible amount of centralization, of stepping up in the sense of uniform statal standards, lots of new institutions, academies had been founded. It had really grown into that mass system that for the first time it was a nation state and a mass scale, being able to produce, again, the armies with which Napoleon swept across Europe. You can imagine from a historiographical point of view, this was very important. Today we're not fully looking at all the major works of the year. It's a bit too complicated, because we would have to open, if anything, parentheses on the individual authors, etc. But there are some names we must make. For example, the depiction of the Middle Ages varied in France between François Guizot's balanced, Enlightenment-inspired portrayal of society, institutional and cultural evolution, through broad frameworks influenced by his role as a liberal statesman and professor at the Sorbonne of Paris, where he sought to legitimize constitutional governance, essentially, which, as you know, in France had naturally been the case, like in any other country in the Middle Ages, but with a much greater sort of importance of monarchic power conferred properly by the estates compared to England, where instead the crown was under very specific limits, and not for the benefit of the country, at least, until it would step up into a more modern system. This from one side, and Jules Michelet's romantic, intuitive, yet less precise use of documents to vividly recreate, if anything, the lives of the French people. and shaped by his Parisian upbringing and passion for national history as a collective saga. And you understand that, of course, a country that is able to produce this, both, is quite complete. I know itself there are different views that, as you understand also in this time, do not separate fundamentally from the history of the nation, right? You can look at, again, Guizot as more focused on the state, on the institutions, whereas Michelet was on just the popular, the almost folk side of the story, right? In any case, they both contributed to a specific view and also a series of... These things had naturally a great influence on literature, right? And again, think that the Ancien Regime had ended from a few generations, and that France had really been raked by a maelstrom through which the rest of Europe had been engulfed. So there was a major role that France had acquired in this process and still owned in Europe internationally, especially before the unification of Germany. You don't have the sense that the French, because that's a bit, especially the Anglo-Saxon narrative in later times of the 20th century, that the French kind of sucked, they were decadent, they were the weaker continental power, etc. So France is still setting actually the military standards in Europe historically. Even when Prussia affirms itself, still Germany has to fully modernize and industrialize to claim an actually superior military culture. So it's actually a very interesting discourse that, again, I shall really start a series about the Franco-Prussian War, but before I have to talk a bit more about von Clausewitz, about other things. Throughout the 19th century, German analysis of medieval systems, just to come back a bit to our nest, which wove political history into a broader societal context, underwent a significant transformation. Initially dominated by scholars of law and institutions, as we've seen with the Verfassungs aligned with certain erudite traditions that, as you understand, belonged also to some kind of political, administrative elite, etc. And also in that case, in Germany, still in an Ancien Regime context, the German analysis of the Middle Ages essentially prioritizing the organic formation of normative systems linked to medieval power systems themselves. So this is quite interesting because it also speaks of the fact that, for example, differently from the, as we've seen, Muratori's tradition, there wasn't much of an interest per se in just a literary, historical tale of the country, right? This is in part dictated by the same type of medieval sources. I mean, medieval German does have, of course, like a very important literary development, but it hardly encompasses, for example, the medieval age, of course, like a statal, or even if were it provincial or regional, like kind of tale of that country. There isn't quite the estate's social, cultural awareness of the fact that a single tale should be told for, I don't know, Austria per se. There are things of that kind, but they are fundamentally archaic, primitive, right? They have, for example, as we said before, not much to do with the great Italian chronicling tradition that is incredibly developed at the time. It's also a history much more inclined towards dynasties. It's a much more feudal world that, in this sense, just by background, does not care too much about the letters in a broader, for example, humanistic direction like the one who was developing in the Renaissance. Again, Germany does have all of this to a degree, but it's insufficient to pave the way, for example, during the 18th century to some kind of strictly historiographical or historicistic interest per se. Germans were somehow interested at this point in reforming their country, in modernizing it, in creating some systems that could keep the country together. And of course, there had to be a reflection on how this could happen with all these different states with different history. And that's also why the German glued the fact that there was objectively a German national reality, even across, in fact, such polities. Think about Austria and Prussia as well, even in their distance, right? How distant they could be from Swabia, or from also from those countries that, okay, well, let's not enter in the Germanistic and pan-Germanistic idea of what constitutes Germany as a whole. You know, as long as the German tongue runs, the song says, right? There is also like all the trauma of the Napoleonic Wars. There is this emphasis on the Rhine. If anything, you know, Germans were aware of the Western frontier is somehow well defined differently from the Eastern one. It basically does not exist. It's like all open to discretion, to die Aussiedlung / Lebensraum, Drang nach Osten. And it's all that momentous, though. And so there are different perspectives, as you know, still, I don't know, after World War I, for example, the Bavarian independentistic movement was still very strong. So you imagine, like 1 century before, how, you know, also relatively daring the idea of coagulating Germany into something unitary really was, and how much the lack of this united chronicling and or awareness about the entirety of Germany had existed. You see, this is very important because in the later Middle Ages, you don't really have a tale of the entire Germany. The Germans didn't think in those terms. They knew, of course, that there was a broader monarchy, that there was a power that was imperial also in nature. But, I don't know, a Frisian or a Styrian with one another, while being German, didn't properly care to bridge, to gap like their differences. Like, it was a completely different mentality where those peoples were respectively under their own lord. They had, if anything, some level of provincial awareness, one that mirrored the old stem duchies of some sort, even though at this point they had been irreversibly complicated by feudal seigneurial divides. And in fact, these were highly elite, sort of feudal-led systems that didn't leave also much space for a more robust gentry or political system capable of providing like a more uniform sense of shared culture. Even, and this is mostly due to the level of political and social development. Other countries without still a unity had, however, the idea that histories of the whole country were, or at least they ended up talking not of the whole country in these terms, but still basically covering that and showing the horizons that they cover. And so these first scholars, these original scholars, were part themselves of the historical school of law. They had studied Roman law. I made a video about the Rezeption in Germany, which is the adoption of Roman law in the 16th century. I also made a video about the Dutch school, if anything. And this branch, by the way, was, as we've seen, also older. From the historical school of law, the still essential today Zeitschrift der Savigny-Stiftung für Rechtsgeschichte emerged under, in fact, Friedrich Karl von Savigny. There was a Berlin jurist who emphasized law as an expression of national spirit. And so, something, of course, the Germans had tried to homogenize relentlessly their jurisdictions, their juridical systems at large. However, Napoleon, even in his centralizing push, when arriving in Germany, decided that largely a nation-state kind of statal juridical basis was not implantable. He left basically the local German states, different traditions standing. These sort of got a bit modernized by the Napoleonic wave, but they also remained hopelessly separated. So Napoleon issued that stuff in Italy, issued that stuff in Spain, and they worked. They had a very specific legacy. In Germany, this was unfeasible. All right, and so this tells you truly what a Sonderweg that the Germans had. When we look at, by the way, the historical school of law in the 19th century, this also rejected, and that's where you get the national romantic vibe, the former 18th century, essentially Enlightenment ideal of universal natural law as a guide for legislation. They instead viewed law as a normative system arising from each nation's unique history, embodying its deep spiritual unity. This is interesting because the Germans had, for example, adopted Roman law, but they had done so declining it to their own specific needs in Germany. So there was a specific ground for intending the Roman law as the common law, but for what we just explained, namely the failed attempt of basically a uniformity, a national uniformity. Imagine, I don't know, had the Habsburgs won the 30 Years' War. All right, of course, Germany would have gone under a more cohesive kind of juridical and historiographical certification. That had not worked. At this time, however, this type of school, say, of history of law stressed the necessity, if anything, to create, in fact, a system that could have essentially a common law, but not along the pattern of the other countries. And that especially the needs of the specific, the unitary people had to be taken in consideration. This was already naturally projecting the idea of Germanness beyond the political and social structures that were, however, objectively becoming obsolete, especially in front of the ramping up of other powers around. The fragmented Germany in the center of the continent was not really a good idea, right? With, of course, there were these big powers like Prussia and Austria that were, in fact, the ones called to carry out that unification. But in general, right, the broader picture pushed for this kind of obvious, advantageous unification. Influenced by expanding documentary evidence and Europe's industrial revolution, so to say, this school of law gave rise to an interest in historical economic systems, for example, because it was believed, given that there was a lot of debate regarding economics, given the much more centralized and planned industrial policies, etc., that a way, at least, to achieve that sort of political unity passed from an actual attention towards the economic. Well, this was naturally already a concept mingling with certain, say, not particularly in this case, but still socialistic ideas. At least history of economics here was being browsed as a possible way to go. And communism had not yet blown out of proportion, but together with industrialization, of course, as you know, with Marx, that lives exactly in this period in Germany, and also goes, as you know, over to Britain and so on. There is a stimulus for especially the unification of the abatement, if anything, of the boundaries, right? The tolls across all these German states, and to fluidify something in a way more concentrated market that could serve much wider and sort of unitarily directed goals, right? And so you have around the mid-19th century, Germany witnessing the emergence of the so-called historical school of national economy. This ended up unavoidably again witnessing also the materialist and international framework, especially the Marxist conception of history as dialectical progression, which was all a pile of BS, frankly. But that's the point. The notion of historical materialism is injected in a system that was criticized from different directions because, the pride of Germany, philosophically wise, was idealistic. It had been Kant, it had been Hegel. So what do individuals like Marx or Engels do? They flip idealism, right? They had learned all this stuff from Fichte, from Feuerbach, and they essentially copied idealistic dialectics, and they inverted it, right? They began to argue essentially that matter is more important than the soul, and of course this guy with all the aberration in traditional ways. This was, again, the new heresy, right, of the era, right? We don't consider it as such, but this is exactly what happened also in the Middle Ages in relative terms. And I made a video about, if anything, the Soviet abomination of mankind, which explains a bit what's probably the Bolshevik ideology that would come later, but was, in fact, Marxistic and Leninistic. And it was, in fact, it had its roots in the 19th century. And this is an issue because, as we've seen also in the video about Stehbart, there were incredibly violent revolutionary movements, ones that properly looked at, probably they were straight away hated, like the clergy, the nobility, and the establishment in general. And so there was an incredibly violent element, as you know, also after the unification of Germany at some point. The Bismarck has to open to the Catholics because the socialists otherwise would have been too strong with maintaining that confessional division. So there are different political alignments reflected by this historiographical development of this specific historiographical ideas. But if anything, the socialistic disaster was made. Marx would become internationally famous. Again, in the video about contemporary history, we'll look better at the forms of associationism, of collectivism, how each country sort of came up with a different version of that, or at least a different characteristic. Concurrently, studies of settlement patterns and agrarian territories proliferated, for example, seeking the economic foundations of medieval development. There was an enormous debate, we've seen it in the video about German Romanticism, about what was actually the German farmer of the migration era. What was the deal? So some of these studies are not naive, but still relatively simplistic, or at least positivistic in terms of the possibility, without deeper research, to understand what, for example, like a socio-economical condition could be in those times, also without too many other terms of comparisons. Again, it's not like they didn't know history and they couldn't kind of guess, but they were reasoning into much sort of technical terms, so to say, and or in fact relatively just materialistic ones. Let's say, how much land did they possess or whatever. This is also very interesting because if you look at the prevalence of Marxistic history, at least in some parts of the 20th century, in some contexts, you find an incredible, precocity in this kind of mentality coming paradoxically from Germany, and not much from France, where paradoxically there were, in spite of greater regime changes, the establishment somehow remained through the state much more unitarily in charge, and was capable also of dictating against specific historical standards through the academies, through the general view of the past. Again, also France is pretty messed up to some degree, but it's the 19th century to be messed up, right? It's this contrast between nationalism and socialism and the compensation of the same that is at times very, very difficult. In fact, this is also really to be seen in the 20th century. Many scholars that were at some point fascist, if anything at the time, because of course they lived under the and taught in the respective regimes, but were truly inclined towards that I don't know, maybe even more military historical study. They were more idealistic, patriotic, along sort of the sort of more classical pattern. Had maybe, however, one professor that had historically been very much interested in classistic interpretation of history, and maybe he had been the only one, if you look at those generations in chronology, that had ever written at least the most advanced and edge-cutting work on the subject, and that essentially informed this with this classistic, materialistic, and socialistic view, regardless of the strictly political meaning of that, but truly by method, by mentality, etc., flattening a big deal of things, and even diverting from, for example, a evidential history of the better political and military ground. Right? There is a lot, again, to study in terms of the individual scholars to understand this better. I don't know whether the last and conclusive video will, in fact, be fully picturing this. If anything, we'll look at different names, but you can understand already the variety at some point, the uncontrollability of the system, because you see, these are the same generations in which rights are extended to lots of people, to anyone at some point, at least down the line. And so ever more people participate to the debate, and it's ever more difficult to simply control the narrative. Even though, again, most states, also educational curricula and standards were pretty rigidly controlled. There were not just more, at some point, some left-leaning governments, still left by the times. Of course, they were quite conservative by those time standards, but still, in fact, there was in mass society from the ministries of education a very rigid mentality whereby the average person had to just be provided with this mishmash of condensated history that had to make it essentially just a worker, successful worker for those time standards, or a soldier to be sent to the front, like dying for the homeland, and in any case, a very low level of education, like the one you can sort of know about, even just from the previous generations. I don't know, my grandparents were, our generations were very detached. My eldest grandfather was born in 1904, just to make an example. And so sort of very difficult times for everybody, but things that we can't even imagine, right? People normally walking hundreds of kilometers just to bring medicine from the greatest centers to the countries. I mean, things that today people are completely separated from in any conceptual manner. The history of civilization, in Germany termed as the Kulturgeschichte, began to center on the primacy of material conditions and economic forces in historical evolution, subordinating even the constitutional history of peoples, or Verfassungs, which focused, as we've seen, on institutional frameworks. This is terrible and incredibly reflective of what I always say, that there is no nationalism without socialism and vice versa, all right? So you had this elite school represented by Savigny that have really brought the best of sort of erudition into the German historiographical production. We've seen how also the Monumenta Germaniae Historica were connected with that. And yet, this broader mass society in this enormous Germany that, by the way, the country had become through the unification and so on, had given way to the lower aspect, right? To an idea that basically, through the almost fantasy on how, I don't know, how much land could this or that guy in history have, all flattened by way to sort of very simplistic scanning of history, of the various eras, and prototypes of person also at the time, would sort of find the alchemic formula for deciphering what history was like that. And telling the truth, this is still an incredibly common mentality today, actually. Most people truly reason like that. And this is not much a matter of historiographical influence. This is a matter of nationalistic and or socialistic influence in the process, right? More people with minimal education that is much lower than the elite that had mostly controlled it up to this point, that pretends to find the basic, the one-word solution, gotcha kind of explanation and determine it, obviously leaning towards some deterministic zone. Like things are like that, just like you are German or French or Italian. History is, right? There are not diversions from that, right? There is, of course, a lot of rhetoric, a lot of propaganda. It's just, the times. How this kind of rhetorics remained alive even up to the first half of the 20th century. That's also beyond. I mean, even my parents, to an extent, were educated in school with those bits of sort of anecdotal, notionistic history about the country without any deeper understanding of history. And whenever there was a more diachronic, if anything, perspective, was on the basis of that socioeconomical approach, which, especially after World War II, was, if anything, lazily put on the fore to say, okay, let's make these kids learn that. And who cares? Like, history is like a B series. They don't have really to know that much, right? This is kind of, if you read the Mein Kampf, for example, you find a pretty lengthy passage, say many pages dedicated by Hitler to the literal admission that most kids do not really have to learn much in school. It's better for them to make physical activity, gymnastics. And he says literally about historians something like, you have to give to kids just a few to remember, just the sort of the more anecdotal things, the more important things in that sort of basic notionistic fashion, and then just only those who will become historians will study history in a more serious way, because he of course hated intellectualism, and he criticized the general detachment from action, what we were saying before about acting without thinking, if anything, because the idea that it was this general instinct and intuition and innate in the German race and all this stuff that had to be excited, sublimated, etc. And literally he says something along the pattern of essentially if you put too many ideas historically wise in somebody's head, you just create confusion, just make people stick to the kind of basics, and then we don't care about the rest. This is really sort of eloquent of the mentality of, in fact, a person born in the 19th century and brought up in Germany during, before and during, eventually with World War I. It's explaining essentially what the future understanding of the world could be, which was not one that, for example, the older elite would have tolerated. The older elite was very action-based, but were also very, very cultured, right? And even though they, by this point, they were collapsing in historical perspective, they would have been shocked to hear that, I don't know, even in this case, the Führer of the Third Reich would have been dismissive of a broader historical notion, which was also understood, as we've seen in tradition, to foster awareness about actual warfare, leadership, command, right? So the dumbification of the masses was already radically advanced in the 19th and 20th century, at least. Of course, the absolute education improved, but the insufficient fundamentals were provided for those people to be effective in another way. Indeed, history works by imperfection. In the past, these people, again, also in Germany up to the previous century, were literally somebody else's people. they were peasants, nothing else, all right? They didn't need to do anything but working and fighting occasionally. Of course, 19th century warfare, also lots of changes. There is the national levy. There's a lot of things going on. And so also for the sake of statal development, you need more educated, especially middle class of some sort. But before this education can come handy at a sophisticatedly individual level, we'll have to wait for who knows how long, because evidently this has not yielded the results that we believe. It's not like you stop a person in the street, and even if you consider the very advanced school curricula in our countries, that would be equivalent to an actual degree or even more, the average person radically falls short of any expectation. And this is pretty much true everywhere, right? There are some countries in the world that never even had that, or were simply brought from peasantry to totalitarianism. At least, in Europe we had some sort of always more organic and gradual passage in spite of the brutal fracture. So you can imagine in those people's heads there is probably zero, right? They're just, again, to be sent, again, into the meat grinder, as we're seeing as well in this time. In any case, this is the path, right? This is the overcoming, let's say, of the more sophisticated history by some kind of more of clumsier, more generalized sort of attempt to make sense. There's some interesting comparing now country with country, history with history. That admittedly fosters some greater result, but it will take a long time before it's going to really get anywhere consistent. Now, by the century's end, a heated debate arose between advocates of the Kulturgeschichte, notably Karl Lamprecht, a Leipzig historian whose interdisciplinary approach was shaped by his studies in economics and cultural history at Bonn and Leipzig itself, reviving the systematic and holistic perspectives of Romantic medievalists, however, in an economic social framework, and those who emphasize the centrality of political social dynamics in societal development. As you understand, a relatively weird combination of, again, a more romantic attitude, but more connected to the economical side of the story. This is really typical of Germany in particular. All right. And interestingly enough, in Germany, that again was here a big deal in Europe, historiographically and politically and culturally speaking. This debate concluded only in the early 20th century, if anything, with the triumph of political history. So paradoxically, Romanticism was not really defeated or forgotten, but in part also retied to actual political understanding. Think about even, Kantorowicz at that point. In all this, after all, there had been some historiographical maturation. In fact, this triumph of political history did not pass through the traditional analytic focus on major events, but in the study of power systems tied to social dynamics, following, thus, the older Verfassungs principles with particular attention to the ecclesiastical and military aristocracy's local and landed lordships. So, fortunately for Germany, in the early 20th century, they got back on track with the right fundamentals, especially for a country like Germany that was indeed very feudal. It had lots of, very powerful ecclesiastical signories, ecclesiastical states within Germany. So basically all that positivistic, socio-economical, weird attitude, trying to fix the country, and because, of course, political, economical policies arose, right? But was, however, surpassed and was at least leaving the national history to a more coherent social, political, and also military historical level. And that's when things start becoming pretty interesting from historical point of view, because the Germans will paradoxically say what Lamprecht, so as the defeated side, had failed, would be instead reacquired by some Belgian French tradition that will eventually cede the consequences of this, as for example, Les Annales in another couple of generations. And so you understand how tortuous the path, for example, towards a more equilibrated historiographical direction can be. All right, and how tumultuous the same German political and military life had been in the process. Right. So remember that, as we've seen also in the video about de Gaulle, that he remembered his mother crying because of the German victory at Sedan over the French. And by the way, de Gaulle had been born just basically in that context himself. So how close? So that's a French perspective, right? From a German perspective, how recent even a unified Germany, and in this sense, a unified German historiography could be, right? And it would be very interesting to, by the way, check on whether such initial misunderstandings and sort of, in fact, intellectual deviancies at some point influenced the rise of National Socialism as a reaction to unhinged intellectualism, as Hitler was also pointing out in the Mein Kampf regarding that sort of, okay, let's not even teach kids anything complex because most of them will have nothing to do with it. That's an interesting perspective, but especially for history, he fears, as if he really feared that those intellectualistic ideas could pollute their minds and confuse them in some way. And maybe that's exactly what had happened from their perspective, but the solution naturally was something else. And it's not like the Germans weren't actually presenting with good works. In fact, Kantorowicz, that had to flee Nazi Germany, surprise, surprise, in spite of being a hero of World War I, just because he was a Jew. And he was actually a neighbor. He was one of those German nationalists that eventually repented in the United States after the war, like saying, with a work like with Frederick II, right? I influenced the rise of National Socialism. Probably Kantorowicz was a bit too harsh on himself, also because he had family killed in concentration camps. So you can't understand the issue. But actually, Germany was especially after World War I, actually flourishing in terms of also historiographical production. And again, Kantorowicz is really a myth, a positive myth, of course, in that historiographical perspective for medieval Germany. And if anything, we will make some videos about him because he really deserves so much and too much. I was just rereading The King's Two Bodies. It's such a masterpiece of medievistics and so imbued with tradition. All right. And again, if we were to digress on all the various authors, we would likely never end this. And that's in a way the purpose of Schwerpunkt. But at the same time, it's important to maintain control on the fundamentals, on the essentials, what we're looking here from a strictly historical point of view, and looking at how historiography was influenced by such background, right? Because otherwise, you can't quite evaluate even the history, the spirit, the tendencies of such countries, and this is again really crucial. Very well, I promise that if you're going to make the last video, that will be the conclusive one. Again, 4 videos for one at the end of the day, and this helps me a bit. I know that this series hasn't received many views, but it's actually very, 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 very important. By the way, there are some people who are fixated with sources. Why don't you talk about scholarship? Well, we do, and nobody watches. Obviously, I didn't make the video for that at all. It's just the cycle that brought it up. However, we also appreciate that there must be a historiographical attention and understanding, because otherwise we think as if history was just floating in the air. It's not. It's the product of this research. It's not, as we said since the very beginning of the series, that it's not like history, as all these changing backgrounds really show, is simply like, okay, I cite this author and so it is. Like, just think about. But at the same time, there is at least always one kind of historical explanation of why these historiographical turns were taken, right? And I hope that, if anything, you see, so much historiography passed under the bridges that basically the attitude of people today is, but this has been debunked. This was already said. This was, no, right? There is no such thing. There are people who are influenced by things. I personally very autonomous in I never like to follow anyone for that matter by nature. But even, of course, if you can repeat this case, it was mostly a history of historiography. There is mostly my judgment as a historian regarding what this this broader development was, but you can always see how no idea historically is detached from the actual context, but also how every person's view of history is different, and this shouldn't actually at all push you to the belief that for this reason, like, you can't simply pick the one that sounds better to you and that you prefer for some reason, and essentially leaving it at that. No, it has to obviously be connected with the judgment of the most accurate type of interpretation, which at the end of the day is the point. Like, history was one only, right? It doesn't change on the basis of historiographical interpretation. The past was what it was. And the best historiography is the one that gets things more accurate. That's simple as that. And requires a hell of a method, a hell of a comprehensive understanding. And let's go on with our own path on Schwerpunkt at the end of the day. As I can't say that I aim to become the greatest historian in the history of mankind, but let's say what we're doing here, of course, does help in that direction. And it's difficult to speak history online. I thought it's easier to write articles. I'll tell you that. There is sort of less challenge posed by, of course, writing something way more precise and with all citations properly, etc. But of course, what we do here, if I were, for example, to answer that question about what is Schwerpunkt an authentic source, the point is that I'm not supposed to be... first of all, authentic does not mean... Authentic means something that literally dates back to the time you're talking about. It's not counterfeited, fabricated, whatever. So already a person who pretends to have a historical education by claiming whether I'm authentic as a source, as if I was, I don't know, a 13th century manuscript, is not in a very good place. But if I were to answer the question today, I would say that yes, of course, I express essentially a philosophy of history, in the sense that I express what I've learned, what it seems sort of obvious to me as far as, my own studies and all the experience that I got from them. But it's not like, since it's philosophy of history, or I shouldn't be cited necessarily as a source from papers. Because if that was your concern, I mean, you can cite me, and at some point it will surely happen. But it's obvious that, given that I publish really peer-reviewed stuff, etc., I'm the first one that, in that sense, I shouldn't be considered like that kind of higher source as a YouTube channel, like any other YouTube channel, right? There are some YouTube channels that are sort of more precise, but telling the truth, I've never found a YouTube channel where there is a person who publishes an article just by, I don't know, making the YouTube version of the same. First of all, I would have to make an 8 hours long video to actually cite one of my articles, and if anything, explain it to them, to you. But nobody does. So retrospectively, I would probably answer that, yeah, I'm actually a good source for historical learning, for philosophy of history, which does not mean that I am, again, somebody who's bending history at his own will, as the passage, the thing sort of passed as interpretation to the usual Redditors that want to destroy and deconstruct and whatever. Things are serious, and they are meant to be serious here. Otherwise, I wouldn't spend all this time actually explaining any of this, for that matter. I also do it, as you know, because I actually improved my own historical understanding. So I don't do it because I'm addicted to it, or because I earn any great deal from it, or because I need this for any other reason. But I find it overwhelmingly useful at a strictly historical level, because it makes me learn things that otherwise I would have at best read once, but that by needing to explain to you actually provides me with an enormous historical depth. And so actually what I'm saying here is I that's always been my purpose since I was a child, to provide an accurate explanation, to actually know how things work. And this is what I'm doing. So this may be a hyper sort of accurate source if you're interested in that actual not even summary, but at least take from a historian, could say, again, a PhD in his own regard, that therefore is not really the last person maybe saying something. I always say that even if you're a PhD, you can't be an idiot not really knowing your deal. But at least, there are greater chances for you to saying something relevant than maybe the average person on such topics, right? So, which is also why I presume you follow me. And again, I am content to appreciate if anything, the support that I receive, because I understand that people like my content in a way or another. It's not an overwhelming success, but it's one that has to compete with lots of other channels and lots of other formats. What I do here, again, is mostly showing you how I think, not talking just with myself, but sort of, again, trying to make sense of history on the basis of evidence and on the basis of certain intuitions that otherwise I couldn't and wouldn't have the opportunity to express or to properly cogitate on anywhere. And I also think that there is something incredibly original about it, meaning that I have never heard this type of historical interpretation, and it's not a bad sign, right? It's not a bad sign, like, I don't know, when there's a groundbreaking theory and nobody cares because, again, they are, at times, they're really idiosyncratic. They may be jealous for some reason. I'm not claiming that, I don't know, the few people who have, there is a consistent number of people who really dislikes me, has veritable idiosyncrasies towards me, but I've never really found a person who, by behaving like that, actually criticized any of my historical work with any evidence, with any method, with any kind of effort or whatever. Nor I've, in fact, received, to begin with, any criticism on that specific topic. On YouTube, at most, what happens is, this guy is not objective. This guy does not... It stops there, like literally half a line, and nobody knows exactly what is that I said, or that I didn't say, that for making me objective or not objective. But unfortunately, that's how, I think, like, the overwhelming reaction. I can't remember of a single person who ever made, like... There are a bunch of people, of course, they also allowed, in fact, my comments on YouTube, that actually made any broader and deeper historical point. Like, if they were either, I don't know, you slipped on this event or whatever, but minimal information, like an adjective said wrong or a date said wrong, which is also pretty rare. And again, the broader criticism I could receive were heavily ideological, heavily sort of subjective. And again, I've never seen, in a conventionally historical sense, any kind of debunkment of anything I've ever said. And the more anyone who tried to do anything even remotely close to that didn't go anywhere with it. In fact, didn't make it to that. And so I'm not saying that what I'm saying is, you see, the reason why I answered that I'm not, say, the typical source you would cite in an article is that it's simply two different things. This is YouTube, and an article, peer-reviewed article, is a peer-reviewed article. Even just by media, they're different. It has nothing to do with whether that historian is proper or not. If you look at scholars, revered scholars online, that very few people watch, by the way, and that tells you how ridiculous YouTube is in many ways. They're actually saying very simple things, like any common mortal. They're not making this enormously, sort of deep reflection on these historical issues in ways that would be, in fact, sort of much innovative or groundbreaking, right? So historians mostly focus on their fields of specialization, and they stick to that, and or also in perspective, they often shroud their shoulders and they say, well, we don't know. Who knows? They make jokes because they realize that YouTube is a joke. The questions or people who invite them are jokes. That the bigger channels who get the most subscribers are jokes, right? So definitely on Schwerpunkt you get something better than that. And I don't claim to have to deserve necessarily more views than I do per se, because if I don't get them, there is a reason. But I definitely claim that my history is good. Not perfect, not excellent, but good. Like by scientific and moral standards, it is pretty good, right? It's probably, again, very good compared to the YouTube average. It's beyond very good, all right? And also because I'm literally the only person who does this the way I do it. And that alone would set me aside. And evidently, I have something to say, given that we cover topics that I don't see covered anywhere on YouTube. Serious, important topics. And so, again, all the conventional indicators suggest that there is some good stuff in here. And I'm grateful to all those who obviously appreciate that. And therefore, I'm glad to continue my work for. All right. Very well. However, we managed to reach the 2 hours length today's too. For today's stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.